It is just absolutely incredible to think about the great Roman experiment. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to trace how a tiny little city-state grew to completely dominate the Mediterranean. We'll see how they created laws that we literally still use today, and then how they somehow transformed from a republic of the people into an empire ruled by just one man. Okay, let's dive into this and see how they did it.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to look at the birth of the Republic, check out their civic institutions, and then see how expansion led to the rise of empire and administering the provinces. We'll wrap the whole thing up with Rome's legacy and a quick knowledge check.
Now, before we really get into the timeline here, I want you to keep this central mystery right in the back of your mind. How does a government specifically built to prevent a king end up, hundreds of years later, ruled by an all-powerful emperor? You know, it's this fascinating story of cause and effect, completely unintended consequences, and honestly, the fragility of political systems. Let's find out exactly how it happened.
Section 1. Birth of the Republic. Expelling the kings.
So Rome wasn't always this massive, sprawling empire, right? It actually started with kings. But in 509 BCE, the Romans rebelled. They kicked out their last king, an Etruscan guy named Tarquin the Proud, and they declared their brand new government to be a res publica. This translates literally to public thing, and they used this term to make it crystal clear that the government was no longer the private property of a monarch. Instead, it belonged to the public, and the actual business of ruling was going to happen out in the open for everyone to see. Basically, they made a strict vow to never ever be subject to tyranny again.
And we actually know just how deeply these early Romans despised the abuses of monarchs, thanks to historical evidence. Take this really famous story recorded by the historian Livy. He wrote about Lucretia, a Roman woman who was tragically attacked by the king's son. Now, according to Livy's account, she demanded her family a venture before taking her own life, saying she absolutely would not be an example for others to live without honor. This incredibly tragic story actually became a foundational myth for Rome. It just really highlights their deep respect for virtue and their absolute disgust for the unchecked power of kings.
All right, let's move to Section 2, the civic institutions, struggle of the orders.
So by overthrowing the king, the Romans had to figure out a whole new way to govern themselves. But here's the thing, this new public thing wasn't instantly equal for everybody. Roman society was actually split into two main classes. On one side, you had the patricians. These were the aristocratic elite, and they basically controlled the Senate and all the public offices. And then, on the other side, you had the plebeians, the common, everyday working people. For literally centuries, these two groups were locked in this massive political conflict called the struggle of the orders. The plebeians essentially went on strike. They just refused to fight in the army until they were granted political rights. And this struggle, it was basically the engine that forged Rome's civic institutions.
Now, one of the biggest victories for the plebeians was getting their own officials, called tribunes. And these tribunes were given what was essentially a political superpower, the veto. In Latin, veto literally means I forbid. So if a tribune saw a patrician judge or the Senate trying to pass some law that would hurt the common people, they could just shout, veto, and stop it dead in its tracks. It was a massive check on absolute power. And hey, it's a tool that we still use in modern Western democracies today to balance power.
Another huge milestone with the 12 tables back in 450 BCE. See, the plebeians demanded that Rome's laws actually be written down. Why? Well, they were terrified that corrupt patrician judges were just making up rules on the spot to take advantage of them. By posting the laws publicly, right out in the open forum, every single citizen could know exactly what their rights were. This established a really core Roman value, the rule of law. It meant that nobody, no matter how rich or powerful, was above the law.
Moving right along to Section 3, expansion and its costs, crisis of the Republic.
Okay, so we're shifting gears from internal politics to external conquests. And the crucial point here is that winning all these wars actually kind of broke the Roman Republic. Through massive conflicts, like the Punic Wars against Carthage, Rome gained huge amounts of overseas territory. But there was a massive catch. Because Roman soldiers were just everyday farmers, being away on these super long military campaigns meant their farms at home fell into total ruin. So wealthy elites swooped in, bought up all this land, and created these gigantic, highly profitable plantations. And they worked them using hundreds of thousands of enslaved people captured during those exact same wars. So the original Roman farmers lost everything. They flooded into the city as a completely landless class called the proletariat, and because of this, traditional politics totally collapsed into corruption, free handouts, and literal violent street gangs.
I mean, this just unleashed absolute chaos. Just look at this timeline.
In 1333 BCE, you have this reformer named Tiberius Gracchus who tried to give public land back to the poor farmers. And what happened? Horrified senators literally beat him to death. Fast forward to 107 BCE, and a general named Marius realizes, hey, I can recruit all these landless poor folks into professional client armies. They were loyal to him personally instead of the Republic, simply because he promised them land. And you can guess where that leads, generals fighting each other. In 88 BCE, Sulla actually marched his own Roman army into the city of Rome. No way, right? And then finally, in 49 BCE, Julius Caesar famously crossed the Rubicon River with his veteran army, plunging the entire Republic into a totally catastrophic civil war.
Which brings us to Section 4, the rise of empire, from Caesar to Augustus.
So that civil war was the absolute breaking point. From the ashes of the Republic, Julius Caesar emerged victorious. Now, to cement his control, he heavily manipulated an ancient civic institution, the office of dictator. Originally, a dictator was someone chosen only in extreme emergencies, and they held absolute power for a very short, very limited amount of time. But Caesar, he had himself appointed dictator for 10 years, and then, eventually, dictator for life. This completely terrified traditional Romans, who still remembered that ancient vow against kings. So, in 44 BCE, a group of senators assassinated him, thinking they were saving the Republic. But honestly, it was already way too late.
Yeah, more civil war just immediately followed until Caesar's adopted son Octavian finally defeated all of his rivals by 31 BCE. And Octavian was incredibly brilliant. He knew the Roman people still fiercely hated kings and dictators. So in 27 BCE, he puts on this big show and dramatically claims to restore the Republic. He kept the Senate, he kept the consuls, he kept the elections, but it was all a complete facade. Behind the scenes, he secretly held all the real military and veto power, eventually earning the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. The Republic was officially dead and the Roman Empire had begun.
Section 5. Administering the provinces, managing the empire.
Now, with an emperor officially in charge, Rome faced this monumental task. How do you manage territories spreading all the way across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East? Well, this brilliantly illustrates how Rome wasn't just a tough military force. They were an unparalleled administrative machine. They actively Romanized their provinces. The army built roads and camps that literally grew into major cities. They constructed these massive physical defenses, like the 74-mile-long Hadrian's Wall up in Britain. They used this thing called centuration, which is basically a grid mapping system to develop the land economically. But, it was a two-way street. They also absorbed local cultures, folding things like Egyptian art styles and foreign religious ideas right into Roman daily life. And to manage this whole shebang, Augustus and the emperors who followed him built up a vast, highly organized bureaucracy of provincial governors.
But the ultimate tool for keeping things running smoothly was civitas, or Roman citizenship. Now, this wasn't just a fancy piece of paper. Citizenship granted actual legal protections, property rights, and major social status. Rome strategically used citizenship to keep their massive empire stable. They'd offer it to loyal foreign soldiers after 25 years of service, and they'd give it to local elites in conquered cities just to win their loyalty. It was a real game changer. Eventually, in 212 CE, the Emperor Caracalla went ahead and extended citizenship to all free people across the entire empire.
All right, final section, Section 6, Legacy and Knowledge Check, the Roman Experiment.
Let's take a quick look at how the empire actually functioned for the incredibly diverse groups of people living inside it. Because despite Rome's brutal history of conquests, the empire itself was a huge melting pot. We can really see this in the writings of Philo. He was a Jewish ambassador living in the 1st century CE. Philo noted that right there in the city of Rome, many Jewish people who had originally been brought as captives were actually freed, and they were allowed to maintain their complex ancestral customs, even living in their own districts with their own synagogues. So while Rome could absolutely be hostile and violent, they later completely destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem, at other times they actually accommodated a really vast array of different cultures, religions, and peoples within their borders.
So what does this all mean for us today? Why does it matter? Well, because Rome's legacy is quite literally built into the foundation of our modern world. The Latin they spoke, it evolved directly into the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian. They're incredible engineering marvels. Those vast networks of roads and aqueducts, they set the gold standard for civilization. But honestly, their absolutely greatest legacy is civic. The ideas of representative assemblies, senates, the concept of written laws protecting everyday citizens, and the use of the executive veto. These were the foundational building blocks for Western civilization and the modern democracies we live in today.
Now, what's really interesting about this next slide is, it's a chance for us to pause and think.
Let's put it all together. We learned early on that the Romans hated kings and they fiercely loved their republic. So, how did the very act of conquering the Mediterranean accidentally destroy that republic? See if you can recall that chain of events we talked about earlier.
Did you get it? Here's that crucial cause and effect. The conquest kept everyday farmers away at war for way too long, which totally ruined their small family farms. Wealthy elites bought up all that land and started using enslaved labor instead. That created a massive, struggling class of landless poor Romans in the city. Then opportunistic generals recruited those desperate people into professional client armies. Suddenly, those soldiers were loyal only to the general who was paying them, rather than to the Roman Republic itself. And that, of course, led directly to civil war, the rise of dictators, and finally, the rule of an all-powerful emperor.
So in the end, Rome fell from a proud republic governed by laws into an empire ruled by the whims of men. It really stands as history's greatest warning. It proves that even the most powerful, well-designed civic institutions are fragile if the people and the system lose their balance. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. As you look around the world today, how do modern democracies ensure that they avoid Rome's fate? It's something to think about. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.